Fred Ryan, thank you so much for joining us on one of our Zoom leadership series to discuss your absolutely awesome and fascinating book, Wine and the White House, A History. Thank you for being here.
A pleasure, Bruce. Thank you for having me, and Steve.
And the Steve you mentioned, for those who have been to some of these but haven't met my colleague, Steve Haro, many of you, certainly our clients, know him as former Assistant Secretary of Commerce in the Obama administration, former Chief of Staff to Senators Martin Heinrich and Dianne Feinstein, or former senior staffer to now HHS Secretary Javier Becerra. And you thought that was the value Steve brings. That's nothing. That's Steve's weaker value add. Steve's greater value add is he knows more about wine than anybody at the firm. I didn't say you love it more, Steve, because Elise loves it as much as you love it. But I think you know more. Is that fair?
Fair. That's a fair assessment, Bruce. Thank you.
Awesome. And for those wondering, that's a Loyola Chicago scarf that Steve is wearing. Let's agree we're not going to talk partisan politics, and we're not going to talk NCAA tournament because it would get ugly in any direction if we went there. What we hoped we would do is that Steve and I are going to ask Fred a little bit about the book and then urge folks with questions. We're not talking partisan politics, but if you have questions about wine or prior White Houses or presidents and their wines, the book is awesome. It's an unbelievably great coffee table book. It's a great gift if you're looking for a gift to anybody interested in these sorts of things. Throw a question into the chat if you would like to ask a question. Steve will look through and call upon folks, but be advised, when you get called upon, the first thing Steve's going to want to know is what you're drinking. He will then judge you on that. I will not, because it's red or white, and then you've lost me at that point. But I'm interested. Fred, we're going to start by turning to you, though, and I'm going to ask from time to time more questions about you and what got you into the book. And Steve's going to ask much better questions about wine and a lot of the contents of the book. But for many folks, the first obvious question is, what inspired you to research and write a book about every president and how wine has helped shape their presidencies and the White House?
Well, I'm involved with a group that I think many of you may know of called the White House Historical Association. It was started by Jacqueline Kennedy 60 years ago. And the purpose of the association is to inform the public about the institution of the presidency. It's not political. In fact, our board consists of people, Democrats, Republicans, and academics, and a number of different people. And the association has been publishing books about the White House for years. We've done when you visit the White House, there's the historic guide. They've done books on music in the White House and art in the White House and architecture of the White House, but there had never been a book about wine in the White House. So I proposed it, and everybody thought it was a great idea. And they said, well, you're interested in wine and you're interested in the White House, so why don't you write it? So that's kind of what led to it. And I would just say, just that so you don't think I'm just shamelessly hawking this for a commercial purpose, all the proceeds from the book, 100%, whether you buy it on Amazon or the Historical Association, whatever, all go to educational purposes of the White House Historical Association. It's all been underwritten. So 100% of the money goes to that. So a little less, thank you, Ben. I got this thumbs up. I feel less guilty about it, but there had never been a book. There had been a book about presidents, countless books about presidents. But wine, as I found when I got into this, has been with us really since the beginning of of the United States as a country, and has been played an important part in virtually every one of our presidencies. So to a long answer to your question, Bruce, it started off to be a little less ambitious. It was going to be a very short book about presidents and wines. And I just found the more I got into it, as I suspect other people on this Zoom who have written books, the more, or journalists, I see James Holman, my friend and colleague from the Washington Post, who writes daily, does such a great job. You get into this and you learn more and more, and it's hard to edit yourself. So this book is now, it weighs 5.5 pounds. And I thought, and as I was doing it also, I was talking to a lot of scholars and researchers. I was finding original material, and I thought, well, this is too good not to put in. I found documents that hadn't even been uncovered before about presidents' wine interests and what they spent on wine. So I thought, if this is going to be the only book, at least for the time being, might as well make it comprehensive. So it's got every president, what their interests are. It has the evolution of how different wines changed from our country from the early days to today. It has glassware. That was an interesting thing I learned about presidential glassware and how the significance it played. And then there's a lot on just what was served with by different presidents with their menus. So if you want to recreate a menu, you can do that. And then kind of the final chapter was it's a comprehensive list of every wine that's been served at any official event at the White House since the 1950s. So wine enthusiasts can find a current release of a wine, or if they want to really go big, they can find that actual vintage that was served back in the Kennedy dinner if you want, and you can recreate it.
Terrific. Steve, I'm going to turn to you for a couple. Maybe you and I bat back and forth while the chat starts filling up, and then we'll make at least half of this questions from the field, as it were.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I actually would like to go right to Toby Young, Bruce, if I can, because
Of
Toby,
course.
question got his question in for Fred a few days back. So Toby, again, ground rules: unmute yourself, tell us what you're drinking, and then ask Fred your question.
Well, first I'll say hello to Fred, Fred, it's Toby Young. I haven't
Hi,
seen
Toby. Really nice to see you.
with Justice Gorsuch. It's nice to see you. It's still a little bit earlier here in Texas, but I am enjoying a William Chris wine from Hill Country that I hope President Johnson would be pleased to see such a great industry growing in his backyard from where he grew up. And I'm with Cognizant right now. My question for you, having worked for a former president like you, and knowing that everything has to be purchased from the USA when you're serving it these days, and reading about your book, The Politics of Wine Becoming an American Wine, is that the same politics in foreign countries? Is there ever a day American wines are going to be considered elite enough to be served at foreign state dinners? Particularly now as we're kind of beating some of the European countries in wine competitions, and our vines are saving some of theirs with some of the disease that's captured some of their vineyards. I'm curious if their politics are like ours.
Well, it's a great question, Toby. I would say that, well, first off, right now, American wines are served at major events around the world, particularly when American presidents are hosting events, when they're doing, if there's a, say, in fact, in the case of George Bush 43, who I know you've worked for, he was in, for example, in London with Mrs. Bush in 2003 for a state dinner that the Queen hosted. And then there was the reciprocal dinner at the American ambassador's residence, the Winfield House. And the Bushes were very careful to they picked two wines that they served. One was a Chardonnay, a Newton Chardonnay, and the other was Peter Michael, a red by Peter Michael. Well, the history on that is Newton is a British winemaker who moved to the United States. He was making the American wine, Chardonnay, in California, but there was a British connection, so they decided to serve it to the Queen. And Peter Michael is Sir Peter Michael, a British gentleman who was knighted by the Queen and makes wine, owns a winery in the United States. So he was able to serve American wines, but have this connection to the country that he was in. I would guess, and by the way, the Bushes, they must have gotten the word that the royal family really liked those wines, because 2 years later, Prince Charles and Camilla came to the White House, and I looked to see what the wines were. It was the same two wines, the Newton Chardonnay and the Peter Michael Les Pavots red. And then 2 years after that, in 2007, the Queen herself came to the White House, and they served the Queen the same two wines. So word must have come back that those have the royal seal of approval. But in terms of just broad international events, I would suspect that in certain countries that are just wine superpowers, France and Italy and Spain, it may be a while. Australia, before American wines become the choice wine for an event, but maybe in other countries that don't have quite the wine reputation, maybe in Korea or Japan or some other countries that don't make wine, that might be a place where American wines would start to become in the forefront of important celebrations.
Great. Thank you.
Thanks, Toby.
Sure.
We're actually going to go to, again, one of the fathers of the internet, Vince Cerf, who has two questions. I'm going to answer his second question, which is when to open an 05 Latour. And the answer there is any time I'm in the kitchen with you, Vin. So let's just, that's the right way to go.
It's a serious
first. Don't open it now. Don't open it now. I'm not there. But tell us what you're drinking, and then ask Fred your question.
Well, actually, I managed to snag a nice white burgundy. So I'm happy with that. But I am curious about the Latour. Because the last time I opened one was in 1990, and it was still seemed a little hard and wanted to wait longer in the bottle. So what's your experience with the Latours? Are we talking 20 or 30?
30 years, especially the 05.
Wow. Okay. So now we have a problem of not knowing when we buy a bottle whether we'll still be alive to drink it when it's ready. The presidential question I had relates to President Jefferson, whom I understood tried to grow grapes for red wines and did not succeed. Am I remembering that correctly? And am I remembering that Mark Warner, as governor, did succeed in growing some reasonable reds here in the state of Virginia?
Ben, I think you're right on both counts. Jefferson, one thing I discovered in doing this book was there were certain presidents that were standouts in the world of wine. Some more recently, but certainly many of our early presidents. But Thomas Jefferson was heads above them all as kind of the founding father of American wine. He embraced it when he was our emissary in Paris. Benjamin Franklin was over there, and they spent time learning about it. He went out and traveled around the wine country of France and Italy, Germany, and then he figured out how to get quality wines back to the White House. And also, by the way, he built the first wine cellar. He as you know, George Washington didn't live in the White House. John Adams, our second president, was the first one to live in the White House. And it was only partially finished when he left and Thomas Jefferson came in. There was kind of a punch list type situation. And Jefferson said, well, where's the wine cellar? And there wasn't one. So he designed the wine cellar and built it. It was under the north portico of the White House, the part that you see from Pennsylvania Avenue right now. And he built a replica at Monticello. So if you have a chance to visit Monticello, you can see pretty much a replica of what was in the White House. But when he left office, to answer your question, he wanted to raise grapes and make wine. And he teamed up with an Italian winemaker named Philip Massey, whose family to this day, 26 generations into it, they're making wine in Tuscany, really terrific winemaker. But their early ancestor, Philip Massey, teamed up with Thomas Jefferson and they began to grow grapes. They succeeded in growing grapes, but during Jefferson's lifetime, they were never able to make wine. But fast forward to today, Mark Warner was a great governor in terms of encouraging wine production. There are now a number of wineries in Virginia. Steve and Jean Case have one called Early Mountain that's not too far from Monticello that's making a terrific wine. And then closer to Washington, there's one that people on this Zoom may be familiar with called RDV. Rutger de Vink is the owner and has worked really hard to make a high quality wine. And ironically, his property was surveyed by George Washington. So it comes all the way back to our first president. But his wine, Mrs. Obama, was out, which she would have wine tastings with her girlfriends, and they would sometimes at the White House and sometimes at a winery. She was out at RDV, enjoyed the wine. In fact, she enjoyed it so much that she served it at the next state dinner. First Virginia wine to be served at a state dinner.
And I'll throw out there, Fred, Michael Casbar has thrown in the chat function that we should also be checking out Octagon and Berberville vineyards
Yep.
as well.
Absolutely.
So can I jump in with a quick question before we go to Cara Dame, Fred? And to follow the rules, I am drinking a Stromsberg Blanc de Blanc 2017. Fred, at a certain point throughout our time together, you can explain why Stromsberg Blanc de Blanc plays an important role in wine diplomacy, if you will. But you mentioned the early presidents had a love of wine. And one of the things that I really enjoyed about the book was reading about the presidents really of the first 50 years of our country's history seemed to really be into wine and seemed to spend a whole lot of money on it.
Yes.
Was it their money or was it government money?
Well, in some cases, it was government money. For example, when the White House was burned, Madison was obviously the president. It was burned, and incidentally, when it was burned in 1814 by the British, we know that it was. We hear the story. We learned it in elementary school about how Dolly Madison said, "Save that picture of George Washington," and the picture was taken out, the painting, and now that painting is back in the White House. It's in the East Room. But what I was wondering about, Jefferson had been president a couple presidents before that, and he'd built the wine cellar, as I mentioned, and he stocked it. I want to know what happened to the wine when the White House was burned. And what happened, I found out, was the British burned the White House, and then they left to go burn the Capitol. And then the American soldiers arrived at the White House, and they discovered this White House in flames, but there was this wine cellar down there. So the American soldiers drank all the wine that was in the White House wine cellar. But to answer your question about where the money came from, the next president, Monroe, was given a congressional appropriation to restore the White House and the White House furnishings. And he used part of the money, it caused a bit of a scandal at the time, he used part of the money to buy 1,200 bottles of wine to go into the White House. And earlier records, I found records from George Washington, even before he was president, where he had ordered kegs of Madeira and claret, red wine, to be delivered to his soldiers when they're having their war council meeting. This was back all the way in 1788. I don't know if he paid for that or if the army, that came out of the army budget. Jefferson himself paid for the wines in the White House when he was president, and he would spend an average in today's dollars of $70,000 a year on wine in the White House. And he kept, and I found this document, I put it in the book, he kept a detailed record of every single wine that he served in the White House, by variety, by year, in his own hand. And it was fascinating to come across this, and I've included in there, but he paid himself out of his own funds.
Good. Okay, Kara Daming, you are up with Ken Royal and David Moffat on deck. Kara, unmute, tell us what you're drinking. Jump in and ask Fred a question.
Sounds good. All right, sounds good. We are drinking some Baby Blue. It's Blue Rock, it's a California red. And our question was related to the best, I guess, collection of wine, either personally or in the White House on reserve. Which president had the best collection?
It'd probably be hard to say who had the best collection. I would, if you ask me who served the best wines, I think, and that comes to one of the wines that Vince Cerf mentioned earlier, Chateau Latour, the Kennedys, I would say, served the best wines consistently in the White House. And I included in there, in the book, a number of the menus that showed the actual wines that were served. And I think a lot of it was, the White House was starting to move towards American wines, at least as for lesser events during the Eisenhower administration. And then they were starting to surface, but the Kennedys, with Jacqueline Kennedy being so focused on everything French and the elegance of the White House, restoring the White House, served the best wines of the world at that time. All of the first growths from Bordeaux, the Mouton Rothschild, Chateau Latour, Margaux, they were all served. And I would just say consistently, at least in my opinion, the best probably was during the Kennedy years. A couple of interesting things though about the Kennedy years. That was when we were going through this period that America was changing its wine consumption habits. We were embracing wine unlike we had in the past. If you look back, we had Prohibition, 1920 to 1933, and then we had World War II. And between Prohibition essentially wiping out most of America's winemaking ability, and then you had Prohibition, we weren't importing anything. The United States kind of became a cocktail nation. That was the era of the cocktail. And but it began in pop culture, wine began to come back and become more of a popular thing, a luxury that was appreciated. And one interesting thing I found with the Kennedys was John Kennedy was an enthusiast of the James Bond movies that had just come out during his presidency and the Ian Fleming novels. And you may remember there was, for those who are on the phone who are James Bond movie fans, the very first one, Dr. No, there was a scene where James Bond was having dinner and he grabs a bottle of champagne off the table and he's going to use it to hit the guard. And Dr. No very calmly says, that's a Dom Perignon 55. It would be a pity to break it. And James Bond sits it back down on the table. That movie was released in May of 1962. In June of 1962, there was a state visit at the White House, and Dom Perignon 1955 was the champagne that was served on the menu. And if I could, to Steve's point, just on, if I could, about you mentioned the Schramsberg champagne, I know that he's strategic in making that selection, because one thing that I learned in writing this book was a very unique history with Schramsberg, and it's not really a champagne, it's a sparkling wine. It's made in California, but of the champagne style. The very, very interesting thing is probably the very first trip to Napa Valley of a president was in 1891. President Benjamin Harrison, 23rd president, went out there, and he was served Schramsberg wine. And it was maybe the first Napa wine that, at least in California, had been enjoyed by a president. If you fast forward to 1972, so what's that, 80 years later plus, President Nixon goes to China. And President Nixon, by the way, was also a very sophisticated wine expert, I would say. He had a great knowledge of wine, which is surprising because he came from very humble Quaker origins, but he was very, very knowledgeable. He chose the wines that were served in the White House, and he had a few, actually one kind of wine scandal, but that continues to this day. But when he went to China, he picked the wine he wanted to serve, and he picked a 1969 Schramsberg Blanc de Blanc, the same wine Steve's having right now. And if you look through the White House history ever since then, virtually every president has served that same wine. It has been the preferred sparkling wine for decades, and it's been served far more than any other wine at the White House. So Steve is kind of keeping the tradition of the presidents intact by having it tonight.
I read your book. Ken Royal, you are up with David Moffett, Rebecca Thompson on deck. Ken, tell us what you two are drinking.
We are drinking we're in Southern California, so it's earlier in the day for us, and we're drinking a French rosé called Le Moment. Our question is whether presidents are more likely to introduce wines from their own state, even if maybe they're from states that are not known for their wines.
It's a good question. It's something I learned. The answer is yes, and particularly the second part, if they're not even states that are known for good wines. There have been a couple occasions where presidents have served wines from their home state. I think an early one, or I should say a more recent one, was President Ford. He served wine from Mount Tabor, a vineyard in his state, his home state of Michigan, and it was okay. It was only served, Michigan wine's only been served one other time in the White House since then. President Bush, Toby mentioned earlier about Texas wines, when he would have the governors into the White House, every year there's a tradition that the President of the United States hosts all 50 governors. He went out of his way to make sure that wines from as many of their states as possible could be served over his years in the White House. Varying Texas wines were certainly served. He had the dinner for Sandra Day O'Connor from Arizona and chose Arizona wine to be served. And it was pretty big at making sure American wines were represented. This is going to pose a little bit of a problem for President Biden because as some of you may know, although wine's made in 50 states, Delaware has the fewest wineries of any state. And not to get in trouble with the Delaware people on this, but they're not exactly considered a wine powerhouse state either. So he is going to have some maybe a little challenges if he does that.
Very good. My dear longtime friend, David Moffett, you're up. Tell us what you're drinking. Ask the question. Rebecca Thompson, Juan Enriquez are on deck.
Good evening. I'm having a 2015 Ladera Cab out of California, Napa Valley. Enjoying it quite much. My question would be, what would be the typical decision-making process that the White House goes through for a state dinner? And does that vary greatly over administrations?
Well, the process of selecting wines for state dinners and in all occasions is kind of evolved over the years. In the early days, and there's no exaggeration, I mean, the presidents were consulting. Thomas Jefferson advised 3 or 4 presidents about the wines that they should be serving, so that they had pretty prominent sources for their recommendations. It kind of evolved over the years to some presidents who had particular wine knowledge would pick. Other cases, they would defer to the stewards in the White House. Kind of up to the present, Nixon, as I mentioned, went to great lengths to pick the wines that were served at the White House for virtually every state dinner. Reagan, having come from California, and I would, in talking about who the presidents were who were ranking high on the wine list in terms of their knowledge and their engagement, I would certainly put Ronald Reagan there too. And he was very involved in picking the wines. today, actually with the Clintons, the Clinton administration was the first one to hire a wine professional to be on the staff. A guy named Daniel Shanks, who had been in California in the wine business, and he joined the White House usher staff to help plan all the major events. And he brought professional expertise and I think really added great value. In fact, he was very kind. He wrote a section of the book on how the wines in the White House are picked, how they're stored, how they're served. And it was very informative to me. But on your question on the state dinner, state dinners may be 3 hours long, 4 hours long, but weeks and sometimes months go into planning those. And if it's a royal visit, it is planned. Every single detail is planned. So a lot of time is given, and typically it'll evolve where recommendations will be made. There'll be tasting dinners with the staff, and then eventually a tasting dinner with wines included with the First Lady. And then that's where the final decision will be made on what wine's going to be served. And one other interesting thing about wines, in the Kennedy era, as I was saying, they served the greatest wines in the world, the highest, most expensive, best wines you could find anywhere. That we've kind of moved away from that today. It's not to necessarily, and it's all American wines that are served with very, very few exceptions. It's not necessarily the cult wines and the most expensive wines of America. They try to find wines that are great, that just showcase American excellence and are affordable. And some wines have been discovered. There's Jordan Cabernet. Ronald Reagan discovered Jordan Cabernet. He thought it was great, and he served it at the White House. And Bruce has got it. All right. And it's and that became, he served it to Pierre Trudeau, Prime Minister of Canada. Trudeau liked it, so he ordered a case or two from Jordan, and then Reagan served it to, if you look in the book, I included many of these. He served it every time he had the Supreme Court over for dinner. Someone on the Supreme Court must have really liked Jordan wine because he served it every time. Served it at a number of other important events. So presidents can have their favorites that keep reappearing, but the actual process is very deliberate and a lot of detail put into selecting, and not just the wine. It's the entertainment for a state dinner. It's the flowers, which china is used, the guest list. It's a very elaborate process.
Very good. Rebecca Thompson, you're up. Juan Enriquez and Misha Wallison are on deck. Rebecca, what are you drinking?
We are drinking a Pinot Gris from Oregon. And thank you to Steve, Bruce, and Frank for doing this, but the question was actually my husband's.
Hi, I'm Scott Thompson, and I was recalling vaguely the infamous President Clinton, Chancellor Cole, all-you-can-eat, as it turned out, lunch at Filomeno restaurant in Georgetown. And I just looked up the article from 1994. President Clinton had a 3,000 calorie Italian lunch. And Chancellor Cole, 50 pounds, his senior, equaled him apparently. But there's no indication of an Italian wine associated with that. And I'm wondering if that was the case for an American president and a German chancellor, or if that is lost in the dustbin of history. Thanks.
You know, I honestly don't know what they serve there. And I'm thinking about all those calories. And of course, Bill Clinton probably had McDonald's for breakfast that morning too, just to kind of prime the pump. There's deference has been given, as I say, to find a nexus between the visitor and American wine. And it's been done, as I gave the examples earlier of Bush 43. The Trumps did it when Macron came to the United States. They had wines that were made by American winemakers with a French ancestry linkage. But I don't know at that lunch whether it was just just go order whatever is on the wine list. I don't know how they put that together.
Sounds pretty decadent. Juan Enriquez, you're up. Misha Wallison, David Brown on deck. Juan, what are we drinking?
So it's cold and rainy in Maine, so I'm having a L'Avril Poifer 2010, just a hearty Bordeaux. And I'm curious, how much thought went into planning and serving wine to Churchill? And did the pattern of serving wines at the White House change after the tasting of 76?
Two great questions. On Churchill, I actually found the White House steward's records when Churchill visited Roosevelt on what Churchill was to be served. And it said, sherry with his breakfast, wine and whiskey at lunch, and champagne and brandy at dinner. So he was he lived up to the reputation he had. And the other interesting thing is, in this book, besides kind of giving the history of the presidents and the wine evolution, I wanted to find something that made it just kind of fun. So on every other page or so, there's a little quote, a little blurb that somebody, a president or a world leader or somebody said about wine that you could use if you needed a quote for a speech you were giving, or if you just want to be entertained. And I loved the one by Churchill, which kind of reflects his winemaking perspective. And he said, a magnum of claret, and a magnum is a double bottle of wine. A magnum of claret is the perfect size for two gentlemen who are having lunch, especially if one of them is drinking alone. So, and the other question, that the 76 tasting, the Judgment of Paris, that was a milestone, as we all know, for American wine in the world. And I learned a lot about that. Of course, I'd seen the movie Bottle Shock, and I'd read the book, but I reached out to Stephen Spurrier. Stephen Spurrier was the organizer of it, and he was a very young man then.
He's passed away.
And we had a number of conversations, and he died March 9th of this year. He passed away at age 79. He was making wine in England. But one very interesting thing I learned, others may have known this already, I didn't, there were certain adaptations, I guess, in the movie from what actually happened, but he did go to California, and he did try the wines, and he did bring them back to Paris. But he had originally invited the elite, the establishment of the French wine industry, for an afternoon of tasting California wines. It was just meant as kind of a unique novelty. Come and try these California wines. And the list is a very, who's who of who was leading wine, the top sommeliers and restaurants, Albert de Verlaine, Domaine Romanée-Conti, and just super, super elite of French wine. He didn't decide until the day before to make it blind. He didn't decide until the day before to also serve French wines. And he didn't decide until that morning to make it blind. And it was the blind comparison of the French wines that was the big story. That was the history that was made. And that was, I always thought, reading about it and seeing the movie, that it was this deliberate comparison and with the experts in a blind environment. And it wasn't. It was a last minute decision. But by the way, he wanted to get the press to cover it. He couldn't get anybody to cover it. He finally, he got this one guy, George Tabor from Time Magazine, who was at the Bureau of Time in Paris. And he says, all right, if I have some time, I'll try to come by and cover it, but I can't guarantee I'll be there. And it ended up being a very big story that that in wine history, it was still talked about today.
Yep. Very good. That Churchill drink diet menu sounds exactly like what Bruce Nauman does on a daily basis. Misha Wallison, you are up. David Brown, Alan Weltman on deck. Misha, what are we drinking?
Hi, yes, I am Micah. I'm having a little bit of wine imposter syndrome. I wish I was drinking a Skipstone cab, but I am indeed drinking a Trader Joe's Central Coast cab. Got to stick with the early 20s budget. But I was just wondering, I know there are a few presidents, notably Trump and apparently Joe Biden, who don't drink, but I was just wondering if there were any presidents who wrote customs, maybe in favor of whiskey instead, or if they just really weren't keen on the whole process of picking and choosing wines.
Well, there certainly were some who broke customs, and one of them, now you mentioned, not to avoid your question, but just you mentioned wine imposter syndrome. That I mentioned earlier that Nixon got in a little bit of a scandal, and maybe wine imposter syndrome is a way to describe it. There had been these rumors, and others of you may have heard them. I'd heard them over the years, that Nixon, who as I said earlier, really knew his wines. He would serve a very nice wine to all of his guests at a state dinner or at an important occasion, and he would have a separate wine steward standing over in the corner with a different bottle of wine with a towel wrapped around it, and that wine would be used to serve Nixon. And the story was that it would be a better wine. And I talked to people in the Nixon administration, I talked to people who worked in the White House, I was getting reports both ways. And then I found that no more authoritative source than Woodward and Bernstein In their book, The Final Days, they investigated and they found that Nixon did in fact do that. And they had the exact wine. He had a group of members of Congress out on the presidential yacht to Sequoia, and he was serving a nice but relatively inexpensive wine. And he had a bottle of 1966 Chateau Margaux with a towel around it that his steward was serving to him. So, and it's been, the term that's been used is called pulling a Nixon. So if you have guests over and you're serving them one wine and you're serving yourself something else, you are actually pulling a Nixon. But to Misa's question, there are some presidents who preferred different wines and different beverages than wine. I mean, we have the non-drinkers. It's interesting. 3 of the last 4 presidents are non-drinkers. But that won't, I don't embalm it in the Biden administration. It didn't, I don't think it will limit wine service, and it certainly didn't for the others because it's such an important custom. Obama was a beer man. He preferred beer. Remember, he even made his own beer at the White House at one point and released the recipe so people could make it. And then you had other presidents who were just kind of, well, one, when he shouldn't have been drinking anything, Harding, I found during Prohibition, which was 1920 to 1933, Harding was having twice a week big booze parties at the White House. He was out at the Chevy Chase Club drinking there. He had in his golf bag, they said there was always a bottle of scotch. And I even heard reports that back during the Prohibition, when the Justice Department was seizing alcoholic beverages, he was having them delivered to the White House so he could enjoy them himself.
Steve, you always thought pulling a Nixon was using the IRS to investigate your enemies. There you go.
As far as Harding goes, Twitter was alive that day. That's hashtag priorities right there. David Brown, you're up with Alan Weltman and Scott Salmon on deck. David, what are we drinking?
Great. I'm drinking a Casanova de Neri 2012. So Steve and Bruce, thanks for pulling this together. Fred, thanks for your time. I've got to tell you, my mom always struggles to find me the ideal gift, and she ran across your book and thought it's the perfect intersection of politics and wine. So I've had the pleasure of looking through it. It's just a fantastic piece. A couple of quick questions. One is, how large is the White House wine cellar? And second, what story did you really want to tell that just didn't make the cut at the end of the day?
Well, the White House wine cellar, it was a big disappointment, to be candid. I mean, I worked in the White House. I worked there during the Reagan years, and I was interested in wine. And I was in a very junior position, but I wanted to see the White House wine cellar. And I kept bugging the guy who was in charge, the White House chief usher who was in charge of the complex. I wanted to see the wine cellar. And he finally relented. And when the house was empty in one August, he took me down. And I had this image of this grand cellar with arches and mold on the wall and all kinds of racks and maybe a little bottle of Thomas Jefferson forgot to take over in the corner or something. And anyway, there is no White House wine cellar. The White House today has essentially a little pantry, a small closet that's been configured with those little wood racks, and it can hold up to 300 bottles of wine. And what happens now is, unlike in the past where Nixon would actually buy wine that he would assume that future presidents would consume as futures, and his predecessors did that. Now wine at the White House is all purchased on an event by event basis. If there's a state visit coming up, they'll purchase enough wine for that state visit, and then it'll be consumed, and that'll be it. They keep a few bottles, decent assortment in case the president has a guest over who asks for a glass of wine, but it's very small. I did some comparative research. The Queen of England has a wine cellar that holds 38,000 bottles of wine. And the Elysee Palace in France holds almost 20,000 bottles of wine. And here we have one that holds 300. So that was a personal disappointment. And by the way, the White House does not want you to have a photo. They wouldn't give me a photo of the wine cellar. And I finally found one that had been taken a few years earlier. Found 2 actually. So I put both of them in the book just to kind of say, well, I'm going to get a photo anyway. But in terms of things that were left out, you'll see it was 450 pages. I didn't leave too much out. There were just, I had to cut back eventually on the menus because I did a representative group and some interesting evenings with certain leaders. And to show how the menu process had changed, there were, it changed. We didn't do them for a while during the war. We stopped doing them as a kind of austerity measure. And then they came back with Eisenhower. Mrs. Kennedy had some done in French, some done in English. There was one that was done in Chinese when the Chinese leader came. So they, I left, but I couldn't put them all in there. That's one area I had to cut back a little bit.
I will say, Fred, the contrast between the photos you put in there of the Elysee Palace and the collection for the Queen compared to the photos you were able to get of the White House are both impressive and depressing. Very good, very good. Alan Weltman.
Well, David and I must be twins because I'm drinking a 2007 Casanova de Nervi as well, which is really a wonderful wine. And my question was really the same. I wanted to know about the wine cellar that currently exists in the White House, as to how many bottles there were and what happens when there's a change of administration. Does the old wine go out? Does the new wine come in, and who drinks it?
Well, today there really isn't much in there. As I mentioned, a couple interesting stories though. In the olden days, early days of our country, it did change. When one president would leave, they would take the wine with them. In fact, for Woodrow Wilson, who was president, as you know, when he was president when Prohibition began, he tried to veto it. The Prohibition was passed, and the Volstead Act was passed by Congress that prohibited the sale or transport of alcohol. He vetoed the Volstead Act, and his veto was overridden, so he had to live with it. And incidentally, he was, right after he did that, he was over in France signing the Treaty of Versailles for the end of World War I. And after it was signed, the French prime minister made a point of giving him a really great glass of wine. And he said, drink this because when you get home, you're not going to be able to have any wine. But the issue of taking one's wine with them came up when he left, because in 1921, he left the White House and he had his own wine that was in the wine cellar. And in order to move his wine from the White House to the house he purchased in Washington over on S Street, he had to get regulatory approval because under the Volstead Act, you could not transport alcohol. And he got special approval to be able to transport his own wine cellar from the White House to his new private residence.
Very good. Scott Salmon, you are up with John Dixon and Catherine McGuire on deck. Scott, what are we drinking?
Oh, I have a 2015 Amarone from Villa Lorraine, Italy. I mean, it's a Della Valpolicella. It's very nice for late afternoon. My question, and although I have to say this last conversation sparked in me an idea that maybe we need a national infrastructure bill that will include a wine cellar for the White House and a collection that goes on forever. But my question really had to do with Congress and how Congress picks the wines for inaugural luncheons and who gets to pick when they do that. Thank you.
Thank you. I don't know too much about that. I know of 2 inaugural lunches, and this one was very interesting. And maybe somebody here who deals with Congress would have better insight on this. But for Reagan's inaugural lunches, there were California wines, and he and Mike Deaver, who worked for him, and they kind of offered some suggestions on what would be good, and those were served, as I understand it. But a very interesting one that I can't quite figure out was for Biden's inaugural lunch at the Capitol. That was obviously, it was because of the circumstances, was more modest and scaled down. They served 2 wines from Croatia, and I'm curious on. There was an American owner who had at one point who had owned the wineries, and had passed away. So maybe there was some continuing relationship there, but I couldn't figure out why 2 Croatian wines would be served at a presidential inauguration up on Capitol Hill. But a lot of things happen on Capitol Hill that I can't figure out either. So I got to lump that in there.
Very good. Very good. John Dixon, my dear friend from Atlanta, you're up with Catherine McGuire and Megan Wilson on deck. What are we drinking, John?
It's a 2011 Clarendon Hills Piggott Range Syrah. I think my questions have already been answered, actually, but one was about, is it really true that Nixon was a big Margaux fan? And I think we answered that. And then that I had also heard that Reagan loved high-end California cabs, which I think that last comment kind of alluded that that was true. So. But
He was very big on California. You know, he was governor for 8 years, and that was the time when California wines were really coming of age. And he ended his governorship in 1974, which it was one of, to that point, 74 was one of the greatest vintages of California wines. And I know because when he left office, I worked for him as a former president, and he had quite a wine cellar that he'd accumulated. First, when he left office as governor, the California wine industry was so appreciative, they sent him cases and cases of 1974 California Cabernets, which were some of the days of Bulla Vineyards and Montelena and some of the really, the Mayacamas, some of the wines that were like the superstars then. And he also had others, obviously, he'd added over the years. But one thing he also did, which was fun if you were working for him, is he would pull out wines from his cellar on special occasions. And some of them were quite unique wines. He for his own, I believe it was his 30th wedding anniversary, he had a bottle of 1911 Chateau Margaux. He recorded this in his diary that he and Nancy Reagan enjoyed 1911 Chateau Margaux in the White House for that anniversary. And it was particularly unique because that was the year he was born, 1911. And then I had an experience. I have this bottle, and Bruce and I talked about it a couple times. When I worked for him, I was born in 1955, and on my birthday when I was working for him, he brought in a bottle of Chateau Mouton Rothschild 1955, signed it, and gave it to me. And it was kind of a white elephant, right? I mean, here's this bottle of wine you want to drink, but it was also signed by a former president of the United States. What do you do with it? So I held it for quite a while, and then very recently opened it up and enjoyed it, and it was great.
That's great.
Awesome. That's awesome. Catherine McGuire with Megan Wilson and Vince Cerf on deck. Catherine, what are we drinking? Catherine, you there?
Maybe on mute, Catherine. And Steve, let's make Vince the final question just to allow Fred to get on with the rest of his life at some point.
Absolutely.
No, I'm good.
Thank you for that. Fred, I'm curious about the oldest wines that you've ever tasted. The oldest I've ever had was in 1869, which I had it in it was 1879, and I had it in 1969, but it was a Madeira. And so it's fortified and it held up well. But of the other more conventional wines, what's the oldest you've had that actually held up?
That I have had, the oldest one I have had was in the millennial, in the night of 2000, 1999, 2000. One of the people I was with had a bottle of 1900 Chateau Margaux. Wow. It would have been 100 years. That was 100 years old that night, and opened it, and we all had very small glasses because there were several of us who wanted to try it. But it was phenomenal, 100-year-old wine that could last like that. But I'll tell you, interesting. You may know this story about an old wine. It kind of comes back to Thomas Jefferson. You remember in the 80s, there was this guy in France who had discovered these wines, these Thomas Jefferson wines. Yes. And it was kind of mysterious that he'd said that he had Hardy Rodenstock or something like that. Anyway, he was he said he'd moved. He was in an old house and he'd moved a wall and he discovered all these wines, and they were very old. And there were some that said 1787, and they had the initials engraved on the side, TJ, in the style that Thomas Jefferson would do his initials. And they surfaced on the market. There was a handful of them. And one ended up at Christie's in London, and they surveyed it and they looked at the bottle type, the cork, the shape. They looked at it with lights and all, and they decided this was Thomas Jefferson's wine. And there was an auction that took place in the late 80s, and Kip Forbes, son of Malcolm Forbes, the Forbes family had a really unique museum in Manhattan at the time where they had all kinds of just really cool things, presidential artifacts and things like that. And they decided they wanted this wine. So Kip Forbes was sent over there to buy it. He spent $155,000 to buy this bottle of 1787 Chateau Lafite Rothschild, purportedly belonging to Thomas Jefferson. And two things happened afterwards. One was he brought it back, and there was a lot of fanfare. It was written up, and they put it in the Forbes Museum. And the curators in the Forbes Museum were not the most versed on how to care for wine, and they put it under a somewhat a bright light.
Oh,
And
geez.
what happened was that the cork
Oh, no.
shrunk and went inside the bottle. And as a result, it was spoiled. So they learned that it was a very expensive lesson. But the other thing that happened is this guy who was an enormous, still is around, a huge wine collector, named Koch. I think it's Bill Koch, and the billionaire.
Yeah.
He bought some of those wines, and then he was suspicious. He started to doubt their authenticity. So he hired a group of forensics experts, FBI agents, to investigate these wines. And he discovered that the Thomas Jefferson engraving, the TJ on the side of the bottle, was done with an electric engraver. And that couldn't have been possible in Thomas Jefferson's time. So he then, this guy was investigated, and they determined this was a fraud. He had a very elaborate making, but he was making old wines and was getting a lot of money for making these old wines.
So the rotten stock story, first off, everyone first go buy Fred's book and then buy The Billionaire's Vinegar.
Yep.
Yes, that's it.
Benjamin Wallace. Great book about this Harvey Rodenstock guy who just was a huge fraud. It reads like a novel, but it's true and it's crazy, and it's definitely worth the read. Megan Wilson, you're going to get the last question. Tell us what you're drinking.
Wait. Before you do that, it's Vint. Fred, can we get a signed copy of your book? How do we do that?
You know what I'd be glad to do? I mean, with COVID, it's a little hard for us to get together, sign up, but I created these book plates that are, I think they turned out really nicely. I mean, I'm happy to send them out to anybody who wants one. If you let me know, or through Bruce and Steve or whatever, I would be happy to personalize it for anyone you want to give it to, or anything like that.
Fantastic. Thank you. Sorry for the interruption.
Megan, tell us what you're drinking.
I have a cava today, a little sparkling wine. And I think Dolly Madison is great. She loved to party. And I just want to know what was on her drink list, if you are familiar.
I don't know specifically what her preferences were. I wish I could give you more detail, but there was very little kept on what particularly the first ladies at that time drank, let alone what was individually served at dinners. I found out more about what was served at the early days, or even kind of middle days of White House history, not from what the White House had, but from diaries of people who'd been there and what they recorded. And there were some, like even Thomas Jefferson time, people saying that Jefferson would serve multiple wines. He created these little dumb waiters, as they call these little tables around the room, so they could put the wine on the table. They didn't have to have the wait staff come in and interrupt the conversation, and would serve multiple wines during the course of an evening. And then actually another one that very interesting, much more current, a diary that I found was kind of enlightening, was during Franklin Roosevelt's administration. That was right after, the end of Prohibition. Wines were just starting to be served, and Mrs. Roosevelt directed that the wine served at the White House had to be domestic, and they had to be limited. She didn't want these huge wine fests. And so American wines at that time, many of them were not very good. So I found this diary, Harold Ickes, who had been the Secretary of the Interior, and he wrote in his diary, "I was at the White House for dinner tonight. Mrs. Roosevelt insists on serving only American wines. Most of them weren't very good, and the American champagne was undrinkable."
Oh,
wow. Well, so it's 5:56. Fred, you have been unbelievably generous with your time. For those who haven't bought the book, we urge you to buy the book. For those who are clients, we had promised to buy copies of the book for the first 50 of you who emailed our colleague Madison. Email Madison, email me, and we'll be happy to get a copy. It'd be great to try to get them signed. We'll do our best. This is really, what's that, Fred?
I'd be glad to sign those if you just send me the names.
We'll get it done. This has been really fun. For those who are following along our normally brown bag lunch series, where we're not drinking, next week we have General Petraeus and Ursula Burns. But this has been so much fun, Fred, that I think I'm going to get my friend Phil Green, who wrote a book about all of the cocktails in Ernest Hemingway books called To Have and Have Not. And we're probably going to chase this, as it were, with the Hemingway alcohol event, perhaps in a month or 2 months. Steve, You were fantastic. Well done. Anybody who has actual wine questions, feel free, or lobbying questions, feel free to reach out to our firm. Steve is your man. But Fred, thank you. Have a good evening, and everybody else enjoy the rest of your night. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.